divide my time between my doctoral studies at MIT and work that I do in my home country, Sri Lanka, which focuses on arts programs for children. It started very much as a reconciliation program between children in two communities, but now we hope to use the arts workshops that we put together to get children thinking critically about their community, how language is used to both divide us and bring us together, and hopefully we hope our programs do more of the latter and not the former. And to that end, my dissertation also looks at art and how several people in the aftermath of World War II were really interested in the idea that art could bring people together. And so my dissertation looks at these people and the kinds of protocols or procedures that they tried to put in place to make it easier to circulate this art. My dissertation title is called Protocols for the Peripatetic. Peripatetic just means on the move. So protocols or procedures for things that are perpetually on the move. I'm looking at museum exhibitions because these people who were mostly members of UNESCO, that's the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and ICOM, the International Council of Museums, these people were pretty convinced that museum exhibitions that moved between countries, the same objects going from one country to the next, could be a really powerful way to speak the same language to people. A visual language, not a verbal language, that everyone could kind of understand in some ways, and be able to gain a mutual understanding of different cultures. So that was their ambition. And my dissertation looks at how that ambition actually played out. And as I show in my dissertation, it didn't quite work out as they intended. So I look at what happened instead. Let's see. So what I'm going to do with this presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about each chapter. There are 3 major chapters in my dissertation. And then I'll talk a little bit about my methodology, how I use my sources. And then at the end, I'll wrap up with what I hope my scholarly contribution will be. So like I said, there are 3 chapters in the dissertation. In the first chapter, I look specifically at UNESCO. So I look at, in light of their larger ambitions for peace building, what kinds of contributions they made to enable object circulation. So UNESCO's mission is not museum specific. It looks at culture at large. So that really affects what they think is important, what projects they put their energy into, and what kinds of results they hope to get from their projects. So very early on, in 1946, UNESCO started circulating color reproductions of masterpieces of art. So this was supposed to be an introduction to people who had not been to museums. It was supposed to be a way to get people familiar with the great works of art of the world. And so these were all high quality photographs that went to various places all over the world, East, West, Europe, North America, Asia, Oceania, everywhere, several countries. And their hope was that, like I said, sort of everyone seeing the same kind of art, but sort of like it moving across boundaries and sort of speaking a wordless language, that would people feel touched by this art and feel moved to think well of others as well. Of course, there are problems with this view. The UNESCO picked out specific kinds of art. There's been a lot of criticism about that. I won't go into that too much right now, but this chapter sort of looks at these early projects, how UNESCO started thinking about what they would circulate. So starting very much with reproducible objects, things that can be sort of replicated very easily and are sort of signs for an original that is elsewhere. And in this ambition, they got a lot of inspiration from André Malraux, who was the French cultural minister at the time, who wrote this well-known essay on the imaginary museum, and it's sort of translated in English more as a museum without walls. The idea that photographs could bring together different kinds of art, from miniatures to sculpture to tapestries, and sort of make them all kind of commensurate, make them all kind of have a similarity that they may not actually have in real life. But by seeing all of these objects together, the very disparate kinds of objects together, that people could create almost a mental museum in their minds. So UNESCO was very inspired by this idea, not necessarily, fulfilling its whole ambition, but those were the early projects that UNESCO undertook. This culminated in a 1953 to 1957 exhibition called Australian Aboriginal Culture. It was put together by the Australian National Committee for UNESCO and then circulated to various parts of North America, both the US and Canada. So this was a success, but it was many years in the making. It took 4 years to put together between 1949 and 1953, and then circulated for 4 years. So it built on this logic of reproduction. So there were these panels of reproductions, a little bit more ethnographic than artistic. But the logic followed this color reproductions, especially in terms of its logistics, how it was put together, these flat panels, which you could kind of deploy, deconstruct, redeploy very quickly. So it seemed very promising, but then there was never any other project that was successfully executed like that in future. There was a proposed traveling exhibition called Canadian Painting. That's why I put both of these slides together in the same frame. Sorry, I should point to my visual material a little bit more. But so Australian Aboriginal culture worked out, but there was nothing further beyond that. So UNESCO started to change tack, not circulating reproductions, but thinking about what else they could circulate that was more sustainable. So they moved to trying to circulate replicable standards. So what you see in this slide are the cover pages for several of their manuals relating to museums that they published between the early 1950s and the late 1970s. Beginning the very first manual, actually. So this is important to understand how much they believed in the power of exhibitions. The very first manual that they published was called the Manual of Traveling Exhibitions. So rather than circulating artwork, UNESCO then switched to circulating manuals about how to circulate artwork. So this was a way that they could sort of replicate, that they could identify expertise and then find ways to replicate those same standard practices across the world. So this is important to keep in mind, that UNESCO's idea was to deploy in volume as many things as possible, to get to as many people as possible, and get everyone sort of on the same page, if you will. And you can probably extrapolate to think about how problematic that might be, to think that everyone might be doing the same thing. Who gets to say what this, body of practice is? Where does it get sent? There's sort of neo-colonialism there. But that's sort of UNESCO's story in the first chapter. The second chapter looks at UNESCO's partner, the International Council of Museums. And what it does is it places these two partners a little bit more in opposition than you see them in the literature. ICOM really hasn't been written about very much at all. And the reason is that people seem to tend to think of ICOM as a kind of satellite of UNESCO. If UNESCO is the large umbrella cultural organization, ICOM is the specialized museum-specific organization. But when you look at the projects that ICOM takes the biggest lead on, you can see that there are ways in which their goals diverge significantly. And that's what I look at in this chapter. So what I do is I kind of pull out why UNESCO's projects to circulate reproductions failed when in partnership with ICOM. And what I hypothesize is that beginning in the 20th century, but very much by the 1950s, museums were moving away from a model in which they had collections of reproductions of objects. So not necessarily photographs in the early 20th century, because there weren't, that technology hadn't emerged at that point to such a degree. But for example, they had plaster casts of marble objects that people could touch and look and so they were real learning objects. But in the early 20th century, museums started moving away from this model to think more about how they could acquire masterpieces, really sort of, blockbuster, huge, expensive, valuable originals from, well-known artists. So they started pouring a lot more resources into that kind of work. And so you can kind of tell why these projects to circulate reproductions, these photographs of objects, when they're not really the original, met with a sort of lackluster response from museums. So in this chapter, I look at ICOM's desire to figure out how to circulate originals as safely as possible. As you can imagine, there are very different kinds of problems, logistical problems, in circulating reproductions where you can sort of flat pack, send them off, they're standardized, versus originals, which are all sort of singular objects that if they break, they're irreplaceable, you can't just print another photograph. So it's a completely different set of logistical problems. So I look at two early exhibitions right after World War II, and that were very much facilitated by the fact that the war had happened in multiple ways. So first of all, there were two exhibitions. The first was one of French tapestries that started in France and then was taken to various parts of Europe and North America. The other one was a series of different kinds of artworks from Austria that again first went to various parts of Europe and then North America. And the reason I look at both of these exhibitions together is if you read the correspondence that's being sent between these same people who are sending around this exhibition, they're learning from the first exhibition and the logistical problems of sending that across to create a better system for sending the second exhibition across. And this language is not very clear in these catalogue covers that I've put here, but in newspapers, they talk about the French tapestries exhibition as masterpieces of French tapestries, treasures from the Vienna collection. So they're really hyping up the value of the objects that are being circulated. And so here's a picture of the French tapestries being unloaded in New York for the exhibition that went on view at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And this picture to me sort of is very evocative. It tells a lot of things actually that are very useful for the dissertation because first of all, the pictures arrived on a French naval vessel. So still these military sort of pieces of infrastructure are being used. A lot of the people who were asked to accompany these valuable objects were people who had also been trained to retrieve art that had been looted during the war. So they may have been civilians to start with, but they were definitely trained in military operations, specifically for retrieving art. It's definitely a diplomatic mission, as you can see from the way in which a crowd has gathered around these people. It's a big deal. You have like really big blockbuster exhibitions now, but you don't have this diplomatic quality to them. And finally, you can see in the background a series of crates, and the crates contain the tapestries. And that's really important because you would never send tapestries folded up the way they did in those days right now. People have learned to roll them up to preserve their safety. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to learn. And that will be learned over several years as exhibitions become more and more popular. And the circulation very much depends on what people have learned during the war about military logistics. Finally, the reason why these things can get sent at all during this time was because the art was taken out of the churches, the diplomatic missions, the museums where they were all being displayed and put into a single place for storage, which meant that you could kind of collect them and send them to various places in Europe, which you might not have been able to do if, if it was peacetime. The church might not give permission, the embassy might not give permission. So in some ways, war facilitated these exhibitions, even as the exhibitions were sort of kind of ironically intended to be a gesture of peace. And so here's a quick picture of sort of how some of these tapestries were set up in the Metropolitan Museum. And the other thing that the correspondence shows us is that there's a high degree of collaboration between the people in the museums. They're sort of sharing expertise on how tapestries were displayed in previous sessions, how you cut costs, how people insured or didn't insure these things. So there's a lot of discussion about what do we do. So the precedents are being set for the first time here. But here again, I'm sort of pointing in this chapter to a moment of failure. In the aftermath of these two extremely successful exhibitions, I think these various personages in ICOM within the museum, so that these museum personnel were all members of ICOM, I think they assumed to some degree that these two successful exhibitions would make future exhibitions equally successful. But that wasn't the case, and part of it was, as peacetime became more solidified, those military infrastructures disappeared. So this wouldn't work in quite the same way as they hoped. So here again, I point to a moment of failure. So in 1950, UNESCO put together an agreement, the Florence Agreement, a convention that if countries signed this convention, they would agree to the importation of educational, cultural, and scientific objects without having to pay customs duties for them. So this was a pretty prohibitive cost for many countries, especially the poor ones, especially those that were sort of really struggling to rebuild after the war, developing like sort of recently decolonized countries. This is all pretty difficult to pay this kind of prohibitive tax in order to get educational objects. So UNESCO put forward this convention so that if you were sending across anything from scientific equipment to textbooks to musical instruments, if you sign this convention, you would agree to import these things free of duty. So ICOM thought this would be a really great idea to apply specifically to circulating exhibitions. So on the left is UNESCO's label that you would affix to a box that would get sent from, port to port. And so when someone at the, customs office saw this label, they would know, oh, this is something that we're not going to charge duty for. So ICOM put together a proposal that if museums could follow a certain number of criteria, and this was a whole bunch of things from, does this exhibition potentially help to increase mutual understanding between people? Is it an exhibition that has not necessarily been sent around before? Are there no other museums putting something like this together? But also, quite crucially, are the objects safe when you're sending them across? Can we attest to the museum having the know-how, the expertise to send these objects from museum to museum fairly free of risk? So if you sort of hit all of those criteria, you could then have your exhibition approved by ICOM to also be sent from your museum to the sort of exhibition host museum, and then the box would not be opened in the port. It would be opened at the museum. And this is a big deal because, people in the customs office don't know how to handle valuable works of art. So there's an increased risk when, the customs inspection is happening at the port. So essentially, this label would move the port of entry to the other museum. But as you might be able to imagine, this project really didn't work out. And the reason, of course, is that it made it really easy for museums who were already really established and sort of had certain networks in place, specifically in metropolitan areas in Western Europe and North America, not even all of North America, specifically New York, London, Amsterdam, Paris, Brussels, like the 4 or 5 places that you would think to be the most obvious. They were the ones sending the most exhibitions to each other, and everyone else who was trying to get in on this circuit, they were like, this is just not working. Well, we're not able to get our exhibitions approved in the same way. And so, you can see in the records that ICOM members are talking about this, trying to make sense of it, trying to sort of create more equitable practices, trying to create pilot exhibitions in Nigeria and New Zealand and Australia, sort of all of these, ambitious schemes that sort of come to nothing. So here we have 2 ambitions. One on the part of ICOM to try to send as many original items, circulate them between museums as much as possible with as little risk as possible. And on the other hand, UNESCO's goal, which is much more general, we want to send as much culture to everyone as possible. If it's reproductions, that doesn't matter. We just want to send the same thing to everybody. We want to make it as equitable as possible. So there's a sort of a quantity versus perceived quality friction going on. So the 3rd chapter then looks at, finally, a process that brings both of these goals together. It looks at the emergence of exhibition conservation. And how I define exhibition conservation is a form of scientific conservation, but specifically aimed at objects that are going to be sent away from the home museum. So I need to give you a little bit of background here very quickly. In the 20th century, well, actually it sort of started early in the mid-19th century. It was a very slow start. But by the mid-20th century, many scientific practices, from using microscopes to inspect artworks and how they were made up, to X-rays, to using X-rays to see sort of how whether things had been painted over and things like that. All of these scientific procedures. Sorry, give me a moment. All of these scientific procedures were being used to inspect and analyze an artwork. And this is very different in some ways from how conservation was seen before that. Before that, it was actually seen as a kind of restorative practice. So artworks just deteriorated. It was just a thing that happened. And there was a body of artisans who would very carefully restore artworks to what was perceived to be an original condition. And obviously there's a lot of arguments about that. Should you be seeing the hand of the artisan? Should you be showing how much restoration has taken place? So that was this sort of like very artistic body of questions about what the role of restoration was. But with this, sort of gradual folding in of scientific practice into the museum, the question changed about what, preservation should be all about. There was an increased understanding of environment and how environmental conditions could change the structure of an artwork from humidity to temperature. And so it became more about not the surface of the artwork and about attending to that, but diagnosing and keeping regular an environment around the object. And so, with this move, it became possible to think about a box, a packing box for works of art that was designed to keep the climate inside as regular as possible. So it's not just about, a cushioned container or crate that will sort of protect the artwork from vibrational shocks, but also about keeping the climate inside as close to that of the home museum as possible. So in some ways, environmentally, it has not left the museum at all. So this piece of technology, which is actually quite simple in some ways. There were a lot of conversations about whether they should air condition these boxes, but soon found a more sort of low cost solution in the form of silica gel panels, which they still use today in some commercial form, to regulate the environment and make sure that you don't really need to restore artworks because they are less likely to get damaged in the first place. And I actually forgot to say in the second chapter, another reason why ICOM's exhibition sponsorship scheme failed was not only because of inequities, but because even the museums that sent their objects across to each other that was sponsored were complaining that these objects were being returned in a state of deterioration. So this was a real problem. So really wanting to solve this problem of how do you send original artworks across the seas, across different types of humidity and temperature, and ensure their safety, really meshed with UNESCO's goal for sending as many things around as possible. Because they also then put together a manual, and I don't know if my next slide has that. No, it doesn't. They put together a manual specifically on taking care of works of art, so original works of art in transit. So they were able to support this not only through sort of scientific support, but also through publication of handbooks that then they could kind of send to everywhere. And again, you can kind of see how this might be oppressive. Everyone being forced to have their museums in the exact same environmental conditions when, particularly in sort of subtropical or arid regions, the ideal temperature for artwork is not necessarily the same as it would be in the more temperate regions of Europe. So there's some real interesting sort of climate colonialism going on there as well. But for sort of purposes of ICOM's and UNESCO's goals for exhibitions, this was the piece of technology that really brought it all together. So in the end, while they had sort of tried to create a museum without walls, sort of the imaginary museum without walls, you can see from this diagram, and this is from 2002, that in the end, what made it possible to circulate as many things as possible was to create a museum within walls, within walls, within walls. So the more layers supported the object inside, the safer it was going to be. So there is a certain irony there in that their goal was fulfilled by the exact opposite of their ambitions. So the dissertation ends on this exhibition, the Treasures of Tutankhamun exhibition, which is widely cited as the first real blockbuster exhibition. It opened at the British Museum in 1972 and also came to various parts of the world. And there have been various iterations of that exhibition sort of circling the globe ever since. So on the left is a picture of crowds gathering to see these never before seen valuable objects that were tied to UNESCO's excavation projects in Egypt, as with the Aswan Dam, which was being built at the time, and there were a whole bunch of sort of trying to save the cultural works of Nubia at that time, which would have been potentially flooded by the dam. So saving all of those works of art and then bringing them over to be seen by people across the world really fulfilled UNESCO's goal of having, culture from everywhere being seen by everybody, as well as ICOM's goal of original, precious, singular artifacts being circulated. So it stops at this moment because, this exhibition went on view from 1972 to about 1977. So there was a lot of time in which these objects were being circulated. So this dissertation stops there because this is the moment in which a logistical apparatus that could be described as drawing inspiration from military logistics is now being pulled into a global, sort of a much more capitalistic economy, because people arrived in record numbers. It drew in a record amount of money for museums. And since then, museums have really used exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, blockbusters, to draw in both audiences and revenue. So that's sort of very, very much changed the original ambition from peace building to maintaining museums. A very quick word about my methodology. Let's see. Okay, I'll have a couple of minutes and then I'll open up for questions. So a very quick word on my methodology. I employ a lot of archival material. So what you see on this slide is correspondence relating to between people at UNESCO and the author of the Manual of Traveling Exhibitions. And this particular letter is just about, well, what title should we give it? Do you want to call it Exhibitions to Tour Around the World, or Exhibitions for Worldwide Tours? And then you sort of see on the other side what it's actually called. So I use correspondence to, I think, complicate the more official documents that UNESCO and ICOM send out, to show how logistical decisions, titles, images, all of these things are negotiated between people before they're put together. So whether it's for putting together a handbook or putting together an exhibition, I really look at how people are discussing, debating, arguing with each other, versus what gets put together in the final, which only the audience will see, and they don't really know what they didn't see. There's no space in a museum to show, oh, here's the artwork that didn't make it. There's no museum will say, well, we nearly got this exhibition, but we couldn't do it. So these are the moments that I'm sort of looking at. Another sort of way in which I use my archives is I look very closely at this visual evidence. So these are 2 pages from the original manual of circulating exhibitions on the left, and its update 10 years later. So in the first manual, there was no desire so much to, or rather, desire to standardize was much less pronounced. It was the first time they were doing anything like this. So when they they reproduced some of the forms that the author, Elodie Quarter Osborne, was using in her home museum, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, they were just these little visual sort of images that you can't even really read. So the fuzziness of the image in the picture is the fuzziness of the image in the manual as well. But in the updated manual from 10 years later, they type all that stuff out so that museums can use the exact same wording that MoMA does in New York, so that everyone is sort of speaking the same technical language. And finally, because I'm in architectural history, looking at plans, looking at things, sort of looking at how people are thinking about these spaces for the first time, because these are new spaces. People need to think both about how things like scientific laboratories are going to jostle with artisanal studios in museums for the first time. They also need to think beyond the museum. How do we interact with each other? So thinking about how they diagram that and sort of thinking about it visually is something else that I do. I've consulted many archives for this project because I think it's really important to try and reconstruct what happened, not using just one source. And it's really surprising sometimes to see just how little of the picture you get from a single archive. Even when it's sort of as simple as a single exhibition, just sort of everyone documents things differently, everyone saves very different kinds of documents. So you get a very different kinds of pictures from the museums, not only in terms of, oh, we have a full set of correspondence, but oh, X museum thought it was really important to save all this stuff, but Y museum didn't think that at all. So you're getting a real an idea of sort of institutional archiving processes as well, and sort of what they thought was important or not important at the time as well. And finally, to wrap up, I think what I'm hoping my work will contribute to is sort of falls into 3 major buckets, if you will. The first is sort of very specifically in art history, and sort of histories of museums and exhibitions, but those that are really focused on what does it mean to move something? Like, what are the logics of moving art? And so I'm looking at books sort of that tackle this problem of movement from, the Renaissance to the 18th to 19th century to the present. Each of these books looks at a different period, at a different set of problems, and those have been really interesting and important to me to kind of try and unpack and understand how I frame my own work. And I hope that my work speaks back, or is in conversation with some of these scholars. Secondly, I hope that this work will enter into conversation with scholars who have recently started looking in depth at UNESCO's contribution to our understanding of what conservation is, like our understanding of what our heritage is. You know, even these concepts of value and what we think are valuable. UNESCO has very powerfully shaped that for us. So not just these books on UNESCO, but also sort of other more specialized books on various parts of the world and the rise of this sort of scientific conservation. I see my work kind of entering into a conversation with that, but looking less at monuments and more at museum objects. And sort of to that end, sort of, you know, to that end as well, there's been a lot of recent literature in anthropology, political science, even architectural history on logistics and the politics of those logistics and the ramifications of what they bring to us, what they don't bring to us, who it gets brought to, who it doesn't get brought to. And I hope to sort of set some of those questions that these scholars start asking to the museum, and think about what we get to see and what we don't get to see. So thank you very much, everyone, for showing up today. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, I'm here to hear them.